Well, folks, it looks like Florida voters are finally starting to pay attention to how horrible our Trump-loving governor Ron DeSantis truly is for this state. According to a poll conducted earlier this week, just 2-3 days ago, this poll was conducted. The results have been released, and Ron DeSantis is now losing in this poll to his Democratic challenger, who happens to be former Republican governor Charlie Crist. Take a moment to celebrate that before I burst your bubble. You good? All right, here's the thing. In this new poll, which, by the way, was a sampling of, 3,900 people, 3,900 people in the state of Florida. That's a big sample size for a single state poll. Margin of error is only 1.6%, so this is a reliable poll. That's one of the benefits of having a huge sample size. 1.6%, it is a trustworthy poll, but Crist is only winning by 1 point. So Crist has 45%, DeSantis has 44%. Well within the margin of error. And let's also not forget the fact that we have 15 months until the election and anything can happen between now and then. But even with as close as this poll is, it is a statistical tie due to the margin of error. However, it shows that people are paying attention. And that's the big takeaway from this. It's not that, we may get a Democratic governor who just a couple years ago was actually a Republican governor who really wasn't all that great, especially on environmental issues. Anyway, what this shows is that people are paying attention. What this shows me is that all of these segments talking about Ron DeSantis, trying to keep this story alive about how horrible he has been on COVID, about his ridiculous pandering through oppressive legislation, restricting voting rights here in the state, the transgender athlete ban, the protest bill that allows people to legally run over protesters if they're standing in the street. All of that is not helping Ron. And that's a good thing. You have to keep it up for 15 months. I don't know that that can happen. Because I would like to think that one way or another, we're not still going to be in the middle of a pandemic 15 months from now. And regardless of who is responsible for ending the pandemic, if it ends while DeSantis is still governor, and I hope it does, I truly hope it does. I'm not partisanship aside here. I hope the pandemic ends. I would love to wake up tomorrow and have the pandemic over. No more deaths, no more sickness, no more illness, no more nothing. But if it ends while DeSantis is still governor, the voters here they're going to forget like that. And that's the big problem. They're not going to remember how incompetent he was once it has all ended. I still want it to end. I want it to end, like I said, today, tomorrow, as soon as frickin' possible. But I also want these voters to remember what happened when their state was in need. Where was Ron DeSantis? He was hanging out in Salt Lake City with a bunch of wealthy donors from the American Legislative Exchange Council. He was screwing off over in Texas, trying to make a spectacle of the border crisis that doesn't actually exist. It only exists when Republicans need a political talking point. He was traveling all over the place, everywhere, but dealing with the crisis here in his home state. When COVID hospitalizations once again peaked over 10,000 this week, he was threatening to pull funding from school districts if they implemented mask mandates. As children were being moved from regular hospital rooms to intensive care units because of COVID infections, he was threatening anyone who said you have to wear a mask. That's what the voters have to remember. And right now they're paying attention. And they're paying attention obviously because they're scared because of COVID, because it is a crisis. But when the crisis ends, you can't just forget about what happened. You have to carry it with you, kind of like with the January 6th insurrection. Okay, well, once it's over, you can't just say, forgive and forget. We're not going to factor that into our next voting. No, you have to. You always have to. It's called accountability, and there's too little of it in American politics today.